Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with James Somauroo of HS.Ventures. James, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Glad to be on the podcast today.
So what was your background before investing in early stage companies?
So my background, bit of a long and convoluted story, but I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. So I'm actually an anesthesiologist and ICU doctor by training. And I guess as a doctor, I was always inquisitive, always wanted to solve problems, and essentially wanted a way of scaling myself as a doctor. And I realized quickly that if you do your clinical work, you do great work for your patients, but that's only a few a day. And I wanted a greater impact than that because I was so frustrated that for 90% of my day, I wasn't practicing at kind of the top of my license. I was rather doing kind of more administrative tasks like note-taking, phlebotomy, portering, even in some cases. So in the UK, we've got what we call a study leave allowance, so money that we can spend to help us with our training. And most people use that for sort of conferences to go skiing and in these lavish places. But I actually used that study budget to shadow CEOs of hospitals and finance directors and other hospital managers. And I actually learned the way the hospitals run. I learned the budget levers to pull if you actually wanted to get things done at a kind of systems level. And crucially, I learned how to write business cases so that everyone could stand up and take notice. And I guess to put some meat on those bones, so one project that I did, I was actually working on the neonatal unit looking after preterm babies. And I had to do this ward round where, to cut a long story short, I was telling 10 to 12 new mothers every single morning that they couldn't go home because their blood tests weren't back, even though they should have been back. And so on a day where the pods weren't working, i.e. the chutes that transport things around the hospital, I just sort of sat with a blood test, followed it to the pathology lab and noticed that overnight the blood's just piled up. Nobody started incubating until the next day. So I essentially wrote them a business case to lease a new analyzer, stick it on the neonates ward and stick all the discharge-dependent bloods straight into that and save the hospital 90k in year one, 200k in year two, blah, blah, blah. And so it was through projects like that I ended up talking to lots of technology companies, speeding up various IT bits in the hospitals and got to know loads of startups in the space. Anyway, realized I was making far more impact as this kind of translator between technology startups, hospital managers and hospital clinicians. And so I then went to go and work at some of the arm's length bodies to the Department of Health here in the UK. So kind of leadership and policy, learn how that policy works, how money moves around the system, but crucially how to kind of innovate with those things in mind. And so I kept doing projects with startups that kept getting bigger and bigger. And then I was part of the founding team of a health tech accelerator in London called the Digital Health London Accelerator, which helped kind of Series A startups get into the NHS, which is our national health service, the public sector health system over here. But I basically realized during that accelerator that the major gap in the UK was at seed level. And it was startups getting the right information, or people getting the right information, founders, about how to actually build companies from day one with approaches that go far beyond selling into just the NHS. And so I set up a different accelerator called HS, which is now HS.Ventures, which built and scaled health tech startups from pre-seed to Series A and helped strategically with all sorts of business models from B2C to B2B with the private sector and insurers, as well as kind of emerging markets globally. We now manage one fund with Orthopaedic Research UK, which is a medical research charity in the orthopedic space, looking at technology in and around that. And we're now looking at deals for our new fund, which is a broader health tech fund, which we're hopefully closing the early part of next year. And as part of all of that, I also write for Forbes on health tech as a contributor. And I host a podcast called the HS Health Tech Podcast, which is listened to in 82 different countries. And on that, we talk about healthcare, technology, and business. And that's the kind of go-to for anybody interested in health tech.
We've had quite a journey there and appreciate you sharing that with us. So what excites you today?
It's a good question. And I guess there are some things that are really exciting, but not often that realistic. But every now and again, you do come across something that can do more than just an incremental change in healthcare. I guess this kind of move fast and break things approach doesn't really work in our sector, because you're dealing with people's lives. But every now and again, something special comes in. There's actually a startup at the moment called Butterfly. And they've recently raised $250 million from Bill and Melinda Gates, of all people, and a few others, valuing them at sort of 1.25 billion. And it's because they've essentially changed their technology behind ultrasound. So it can be a fraction, and I mean a fraction of the size and the cost, and doing various things like you can connect it to an iPhone. And for anybody technical, I mean, what they essentially do is move it from this technology called piezoelectric crystals onto a semiconductor, which is an engineering innovation which has made its way into medicine now. But legitimately, you can now wear an ultrasound machine like you wear a stethoscope, which, as you can imagine, has the potential to completely change the way doctors practice, like the stethoscope did. And so exciting things come across our desk very rarely, just because we're more akin to seeing incremental change rather than, real stepwise change. But something like Butterfly genuinely has the potential to change the way we practice, which is super exciting.
Sounds like a great innovation. For those investors out there, what's your advice for them about investing in startups in the health tech sector? What should they think about before they write that check?
Yeah, I remember going to an event once when there was a very experienced health tech VC called Vishal Gulati. And I remember him talking about this, and it stuck with me ever since, that generally, whether you're an angel investor, whether you're an institutional investor and you've done this for a while, you're either coming from a more life science background, or you're coming from a tech background, be that through your career or be that through your investing. And I guess with those two worlds that have developed, you've kind of got one thing or another. And if you're in one camp or another, you need to think about moving more centrally. So if you're in the life science camp, generally you want a really high level of evidence, which is generally impossible to get in digital health and health tech at the moment, like randomized controlled trials and things like that. And generally, if you're from the tech world, you tend to want a lovely hockey stick graph of users and revenue, and you want a really quick exit and things like that, which again, modernizing healthcare isn't quite like that. It's somewhere in the middle. And I think you need to get comfortable that there aren't really clear paths to hockey stick graphs, nor huge levels of evidence yet. And I think you need to be confident that essentially you've got a team in front of you that get that, and you need to get comfortable with that yourself. And I guess more specifically, we also look for particular things. I'm sure we'll come onto our thesis in a bit, but looking for key motivating factors in our founders is a really, really key element to this, like a personal patient experience or a family member going through something, but also an intimate understanding of the issue. So, for example, a co-founder who has been clinical or kind of gets it, but ultimately you need people within the team at seed stage that are going to run through a brick wall every single morning to go out and solve this problem. And they also need expertise in that founding team as well.
Great. So on the other side of the table, those who are running startups in the health tech sector, what's your advice for them?
Yeah, so I generally ask anybody if they've got an idea, if they've got a startup, if they've got a scale up, if they've IPO'd, no matter what it is. I generally ask people in this sector 3 questions, which is, what problem do you solve? Whose problem is it, and how are they going to pay for it? And I think whether you've got an idea or whether you're heading to an IPO, you need to be able to answer those questions super succinctly. And when it comes to whose problem it is, for example, I really need like a name of a person or specific job title, because ultimately we need to know whether things are scalable. And to understand healthcare and health tech is to truly understand that middle question, to be perfectly honest. I think making sure that you truly solve a problem for a buyer is a big one as well. And I don't mind that if that buyer is a patient, if that buyer is a hospital manager, if that buyer is a clinician, but if it truly solves a problem for the person that actually buys it, you're onto a winner. And you'd be surprised how rare those problems are actually in health tech. And with the UK, we've got a public sector healthcare system, and whilst it's called the NHS, there is really no such thing as the NHS. Every single hospital in the country runs differently. Every single primary care practice runs differently. And so you really need to find problems that are experienced in exactly the same way everywhere. And because everywhere is so different, those problems are actually quite rare. There's a lot of what I call localism, which is people developing local solutions for local problems. And I think that scalability piece is super important for people to think about if they're in a startup, as well as just some other basic principles, which prevention and early intervention are where the big gains are to be made, I think, at the moment. You've got to make sure that you're evidence-based as a startup from day one. Prospective studies in digital health are what you need to be aiming for at the moment, which means evidence on real patients and not retrospective, which is on old data. You need to get comfortable with talking about evidence. It's really about how you communicate value in healthcare through evidence at the moment. And the other thing is to make sure you're not a product. I think it's really, really simple for people to think about their startup in terms of this is a product. Whereas actually healthcare is a service. And what you really need to do is think about what's happening before and after your product fits into the system. How is this working into a clinical flow? Are there any other technologies that you need to integrate with and become interoperable with? And you really need to think about how patients are being looked after. If you've got a piece of technology that's diagnosing people, is that the best way for patients to receive that information when they do receive that information through your technology? Is there a human at the other end to coach them through it? And all those different things need thinking about. And so to think about healthcare as a service rather than a product or a set of products is often a good way to start.
Well, that's good advice and very thorough as well. Appreciate that. How do you see the health tech industry evolving today? What are the big changes that are coming up?
Yeah, I think our sector is maturing slightly now. I think there's been hype for quite a while, but no longer are buzzwords enough either to raise money or to actually create any sort of sustainable business. I think we've seen hype with things like AI, for example, but now people are starting to ask real questions about the evidence behind these technologies. And I think the people winning, the companies winning, are coming up with the answers aren't necessarily the people that have been shouting loudest about this stuff. It's the companies that have actually been doing the boring regulatory stuff behind the scenes. And so I think there is, at the moment, this is happening and it's going to continue happening. There's a consolidation of ideas and of products. There's far more collaboration, I think, between startups because, again, buyers, they need a problem solved end to end. And actually, when you've got a very small part of the chain as a company, it's worth you linking up with other companies that happen before and after you, or indeed in the same, cardiac catheter lab, or, all these different things that happen in that one space. It's worth forming some sort of alliance between people that you can form an end-to-end service because buyers are more likely to buy you. So that is starting to happen. And just generally, I think there are more startups, there are more ideas, and it's a really positive space to be in because we're certainly growing. There's lots of people that want to enter this space. There's lots of people that want to work in this space. So there's lots of people out there that want to be hired. There's lots of people out there that are generating ideas. And so it's a truly exciting space to be in.
Well, you now run a venture fund, HS.Ventures. What's your investment thesis for this fund?
Yeah, so we look at, I'm not going to give you all the secret sauce, but generally what we look for in people, we look for founder characteristics. So strong technical co-founder, also a domain expert, as I mentioned, and we look at all sorts of productivity and resilience metrics. We're looking at scalability, as I mentioned before as well. So companies with product or a solution that's applicable across global health systems. So not just one provider and things like that. We actually look for something called patient product fit as well. So we really want to see companies with data demonstrating evidence-based impact all the way back to patients, ideally with patient co-design and patient feedback. So whatever it is, whether you've got a back-end admin system, whether you've got a B2C app, we're going to trace that right back to patients and just make sure that this is ultimately serving them because there's a really good business reason behind that because we're looking for sustainability. And we split the companies up into three major topics. So we're looking at things that are preventative, so things like fitness and well-being, consumer health information, research optimization, so loads of stuff in prevention. We look at efficiency gains for organizations, so on-demand services, diagnostics, things like that, and management as well. So that can be things like digital therapeutics and disease monitoring. And so for startups that are hitting one of those three big categories, we're definitely interested in talking to them.
Great. Do you have one or two portfolio examples that you can talk about that fit that thesis?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, a broad range of startups tend to think that they fit this thesis, and many might, based on how I've described it. But yeah, we like to think we know that we know when we've got the right people in the room and they've got that sort of X factor. I actually did an event in London the other night with a couple of startups that we're supporting. One being Skin Analytics and one being Fibris. So both of those are AI companies. Both are solving a huge problem with a focus on prevention and early intervention. Both incredibly talented founders and crucially evidence-based from day one, ahead of the pack on regulation and compliance. And they wrap, as I said before, that entire service around their products. Skin Analytics are doing it in dermatology. So they've got an AI product which is taking photos of melanomas and diagnosing them at the earliest stage. And Fibris are doing that in respiratory. So they've got an AI machine learning platform, which is essentially diagnosing respiratory disease out in the community before it kind of happens and takes people down. And so it's helping the elderly and it's helping neonates.
Well, that's great. So you see a lot of startups in the health tech space dealing with the challenges of regulatory and the technology and the market. What are the specific challenges you find that the health tech startup has to endure in order to achieve the goal?
Well, I've hit a good couple of points in the question. So yeah, regulatory and market. One of the biggest problems I think we solve, based on our backgrounds of the guys in our organization, is that we truly solve a problem of access to customers to validate ideas and then to sell. So I think in healthcare, it's so difficult to understand and then to find your way around this complex system. And so I think one of the big areas that we make up hard yards is just providing access to those customers. And in fact, actually, troubleshooting with the startups as to who their customer actually is as well. So all of that information and then providing that access to customers to validate ideas and sell to, I think is certainly one challenge that we approach better than most. Scale as well, always a challenge. It's a big piece. Finding a solution that is genuinely scalable. I think there's, as I mentioned before, there's far too much variation, I think, at organizational level to know that something is truly scalable unless you've got really specific experience. And actually in the UK, there are a few companies that are doing very well that have been started by management consultants that have been brought into a group of hospitals to solve a specific problem. And they've basically had that access. They've seen a problem that is genuinely scalable across multiple sites, and they've left and then developed a genuine solution to those problems. So I think that's a really interesting part. As you mentioned, evidence, regulatory stuff. It's always an issue. It's always a challenge. But as I say, starting that stuff from day one's ideal. And I think the final bit that I'd mentioned there is turning pilots into contracts. We hear all the time, and I see all the time, people giving away free pilots and the startups sort of dying of what we call pilotitis, of just the frequent repeated piloting efforts, and they just can't get the organization on board. And I think free pilots are never a good idea, or rarely they're a good idea. I think it's always useful to get organizations to pay for those pilots. And I think furthermore, it's really useful to spend a disproportionate amount of resource to make sure that as a company, as the startup, you've got somebody in there, in that organization, making sure that pilot is run correctly to ensure that pilot converts to a contract. And other just little bits there, putting metrics into the pilot that make sure it does convert into a contract afterwards and things like that. But lots of measures that you can do, but certainly an area that I think startups need to pay a lot of attention to.
That's good advice. Well, you mentioned several subsectors and applications a moment ago. Which of those do you see as immediate opportunities for investors to pursue?
Yeah, good question. It's a difficult question to answer in that I think the low-hanging fruit is anybody that's genuinely solving a problem. I think within that, I think there is some low-hanging fruit in the B2C prevention space, as well as what I'd call sort of a B2C space in convenience. So actually on my podcast last week, I had a company called Alpha. And the founder's somebody called Gloria, and she is ex-LinkedIn, she's ex-Google, she's got Stanford PhD in engineering and computer science. And she started a company out in the US looking at women's health. And she basically asked herself, okay, what conditions can be sorted the easiest through a telemedicine and online pharmacy provider? And so she's quickly done that, and built that and gone after those specific conditions, but built amazing UI, UX akin to something kind of Google, Apple, Netflix might produce. But she's built something that consumers are going to pay for. And so you and I, who already pay whatever it is, $10, $12 a month for Netflix and all these different subscriptions just to make our life easier with fantastic UI, UX, I think there is an upswell at the moment of this happening in healthcare where people are going straight to the consumer, because ultimately the line between health and fitness is blurring. The line between unwell and well is blurring. We actually demand so much of our health at the moment that we're starting to go into our own pockets and pay for it ourselves. Because ultimately, if we can just pay a subscription like we pay a Netflix or something else and it solves our problem, we are far more likely to do it. And the data is suggesting that to back that up. I think beyond that, digital therapeutics is another one. So I think finding a way to scale a treatment that isn't taking pills. People are far less likely to want to take medications if they can solve a problem a different way. They generally are. We're seeing that through things like cognitive behavioral therapy, so CBT, through an app. We've seen that. So there's a startup called Sleepio, Big Health, that you might know out in the US, that are doing this with sleep. But similarly, there are people using this kind of model of digital therapeutics to solve lots of different problems, other problems in mental health, things like irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain. There's lots of these popping up, and I think there is low-hanging fruit there because the business model works, and there's certainly a growing market for things like that.
We appreciate the insight. In the last few minutes that we have here, what else should we cover that we haven't?
That's a good question. I think we've been completely thorough, to be honest. There's nothing that springs to my mind unless there's anything else that you'd like to ask me.
Oh, I think you're correct. I think we covered quite a bit in a short amount of time, and I appreciate that. So how best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
Yeah, best way to get me at any time is on LinkedIn. So you can search for my name, which is James Somauroo, which is Somauroo. And feel free to ping me an email. So James@HS Live for anything to do with accelerators, investment, you'd like some advice on your startup. And if it's something to do with Forbes or my podcast, then you can get me at js@somx, which is somx.co.uk.
Great. We'll put those in the show notes. Appreciate your joining us today and hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
Amazing. Thanks for having me.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.